Welcome back, everybody. I am Cass Pianci, and I am here with my partner in crime, Bennett Tomlin. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well, Cass. How are you?
I'm good. I just came back from the desert. It was an adventure. Today, we're talking about historical fraud, some of our favorite stuff. Today, we're talking about Liberty Reserve. And let's just dive into it. Bennett, what was Liberty Reserve?
Liberty Reserve was the first stablecoin. There were these various exchangers you could interact with. You would use your credit card, your debit card, wires, whatever, to send them money. And in return, they would send you a digital representation of that value, basically a token. They had tokens for dollars, for euros, and for gold. And you would get this token, this Liberty Reserve dollar, and then you could send it to whatever pyramid scheme you wanted. The Liberty Reserve Company itself took a small fee on those transfers, and you got to basically interact with all these other entities, avoiding the scrutiny normal payment processors and things would put those transactions under. And so Liberty Reserve became a shadow bank for a lot of the shady and often censored parts of the internet. Gambling, pornography, pyramid schemes.
And Liberty Reserve started before Bitcoin, actually, and was utilized before that for, besides Ponzi schemes. I mean, you could use it on the dark web, right, to buy drugs and do other illegal things. It was used at the same time as Bitcoin also. Like, so for Silk Road was using Liberty Reserve, but they were also accepting Bitcoin, right?
Yeah, and like Raphael Nicolay, who was the founder of Bitfinex, he briefly ran an over-the-counter trading desk, and one of the things he accepted was Liberty Reserve in exchange for Bitcoins. Early in Bitcoin's history, it was relatively commonplace for people to exchange Liberty Reserve dollars for Bitcoin because it was hard to get regular dollars into the crypto system.
Yeah, and Liberty Reserve was started by two U.S. businessmen, Arthur Budovsky and Vladimir Katz. And these two started it up, or moved it to Costa Rica, thinking that because they were in Costa Rica, they were outside the scope of U.S. law, just because. What I also wanted to mention is that Liberty Reserve actually never had an issue with insolvency or not being fully backed. Like, I don't think anyone even questioned it at any point.
They were likely insolvent, though, especially towards the end. There seem to have been at least 3 instances in which Costa Rica seized funds that were Liberty Reserve funds starting in 2011. And so in the couple of years leading up to the May 2013 indictment, they likely were running a fractional reserve shadow bank.
It's interesting because the way that I reflect on how Tether and USDC and many of these other, quote, over-collateralized stable coins, but they're utilizing all these mechanisms that are, similar to money market funds. You don't see that with Liberty Reserve. Like, these guys were literally just laundering money through bank accounts.
Yeah, it's much closer to the original conception of stablecoins like Tether, where they were meant to be backed, each token, with $1 in the bank account. And that seems to mostly be what Liberty Reserve was doing. And as you mentioned, they were able to, because of that, launder a whole bunch of money through those accounts. So Preet Bharara, one of the United States prosecutors, and I think I messed up that name. I'm sorry, I'm trying.
Estimated Preet Bharara. I don't think it doesn't matter.
Preet Bharara.
I don't think he's ever going to come on the show. Preet, you're invited, man, if you want to come talk about taking down Liberty Reserve.
Yeah, he estimated that Liberty Reserve processed 55 million separate transactions and laundered more than $6 billion in total criminal proceeds over the several years they existed. So Liberty Reserve was a very large and meaningful chunk of this market, and you even saw it beginning to be used for things like ransomware. So like in 2012, the antivirus company Symantec got blackmailed by a group of hackers who tried to get them to convert $50,000 into Liberty Reserve dollars and then send those Liberty Reserve dollars to the hackers, like many modern ransomware attacks. And the reason this worked is the same reason Bitcoin works for this. Bitcoin, it is very difficult or expensive to reverse a transaction. Liberty Reserve functioned similarly. There was a small group of people in charge of it, but they also did not reverse transactions. Once it went through, they let it go through. And so if the hackers had gotten their hands on those 50,000 Liberty Reserve dollars, it was kind of like dollars for them.
I want to know what happened with Liberty Reserve and why they ended up being taken down, because it often gets compared to what we see with Tether and, I don't know, USDC. But I think there are some distinct differences. And in a sense, Liberty Reserve was better for criminals than something like USDT or USDC.
Yeah, so Tether claims they do KYC on all of their customers and clients. So did the other major stablecoins. Liberty Reserve did not do that. So that's already one major difference between these two models. How they finally came down, and I think this is important for us to look at, was a massive coordinated investigation by like 17 different countries and countless different agencies all working together to try to take down Liberty Reserve. Like there's a couple of lines here in the Department of Justice's press release about finally indicting them that are kind of wild. The U.S. Secret Service, the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation, the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement Homeland Organization in Costa Rica, Interpol, the National High-Tech Crime Unit in the Netherlands, the Spanish Prosecutor's Office also provided assistance. And so I think it's important to pause on that because this type of case, an international entity using dollars to facilitate what certainly seems to be criminal transactions, it can be very difficult to establish jurisdiction, and the cases can be very difficult to prosecute. And so often when they finally do happen, you will see these very large cooperative groups of different regulators and enforcement groups working together to deal with the entity. And so I think if we were to ever see similar action brought against a company like a stablecoin, it would probably be similar in that it would be internationally coordinated and involve a whole bunch of different agencies working together to collaborate on it.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that Liberty Reserve started in 2006 and didn't get stopped until 2013. They don't instantly shut these things down. And people always suggest that the longer these things go on, the more proof it is that it will never be stopped. And I take that with a grain of salt, just looking at frauds and problem child financial individuals throughout history, whether it's Madoff, where it took decades, or it's Liberty Reserve, which also was like so blatant, I think. It clearly was something that was obviously not playing by the rules. And I wish I could glimpse back then and see if there were people like you and I back in 2007 or 8 saying like, there's no way this shit flies.
I'm sure there was probably at least one or two people who were saying things like that. Part of the reason Liberty Reserve in particular is so fascinating is what we so often see with these various financial frauds is that they do not end because of law enforcement intervention or regulator intervention. They almost always end because they end up collapsing under their own weight. For some reason, they're no longer able to sustain the fraud. But as far as I can tell, Liberty Reserve is one where they were truly ended by the law enforcement intervention. And this is a case where one day, Liberty Reserve is functioning fine. The next day, if you visited the website, you were directed to a statement saying that this domain has been seized. I think it's important that people understand that when the law enforcement action comes, it can be sudden and it can be final.
Now, I think blockchain advocates would tell us that there's a distinct difference here. So first of all, we don't know exactly what the mechanism is for printing tethers or freezing tethers or burning tethers. I'm under the guise that it is a 2 out of 3 multisig or something along those lines. That's just my thoughts on what it would be, where you'd have 2 of the important executives who would be uncompromisable agreeing to mint X amount at a certain time. Liberty Reserve really had no mechanism like that. But also, blockchain advocates would say that as long as this US dollar representation is on the blockchain at all, that it therefore exists and can always be clawed back.
What do you mean by clawed back?
Well, honestly, I mean, a few things, because there would be multiple ways that I'm sure large tether holders would try to. One, I'm sure you could go through the right channels, similar to what's going on with Mount Gox or whatever, if there was some sort of, or I assume maybe not for, I guess it didn't happen for Liberty Reserve, but you could go through the right channels, prove who you are. And I don't know. I honestly don't know if that would work. But I also would assume that people would just create a one-to-one prove X amount of tethers are yours and be able to transition out to my blockchain equivalent of a tether. I remember Justin Sun saying something about that when there was some stablecoin issue. Do you remember that?
Yeah, Justin Sun basically at one point promised when we were harping on redemptions for Tether, and so Justin Sun's idea was to respond by saying he'd give people dollars for Tether. I'm not under the impression that he ever actually did that, but that is what he said he was going to do, I think. And I think Sam Bankman-Fried might have made a similar joke at one point. Yeah, and so you're right that the tokens on the blockchain are there. I think there's still a significant portion of people who are not aware that Tether can and regularly does freeze those tokens, that they control a blacklist at the contract level that makes it so they can prevent anyone from sending their tethers, and that they add to this blacklist way more frequently than the other stablecoins do. I know on Twitter I'll often see people say that one of the reasons people use Tether is this belief that it's more censorship resistant, less likely to be frozen, things like that. But Tethers are frequently frozen. And if, for example, the US government were able to compromise a sufficient number of people who have to sign for that, they could freeze all of the Tethers. And besides, even if the Tethers aren't frozen, if the Fed sees the bank accounts, the brokerage accounts, wherever the assets are, I'm not convinced that the tokens retain much value after that point.
Yeah, I don't know if they do or they don't. I mean, the reality is there's always someone willing to make some kind of bet, right? I remember someone on cryptocurrency Twitter buying up a ton of Helios and Matheson, which was the company that did MoviePass, as they were going bankrupt, being like, yeah, I'm doing this. So there's always someone who's willing to make a bet, even if the bet seems absurd. And I would suggest, based on what we've seen with Tether previously, so we know that nearly a quarter of all tethers, or over a quarter of all tethers, were essentially out of commission for a while, seized, right? That this money couldn't be accessed. And what did the cryptocurrency community do? I mean, they got together and made that money appear out of thin air, right?
That's the story.
Well, it's interesting to me because we're talking about Liberty Reserve. We're talking about this in many ways different, but in most ways similar operation, right? This US dollar derivative token, digital token, not quite the same, but very similar. And when they got nabbed, when they started having these issues, when their funds started getting seized, there was no community building up around them to suggest, like, we're going to save Liberty Reserve. No one did that. And I'm not sure what the difference is this time. Is it because there's a community that understands the importance of this US dollar derivative and is willing to make sacrifices to ensure that it continues to exist? Or is it similar in that regulators haven't made a move yet, and as soon as they choose to, it's over? I mean, I don't exactly understand it fully in terms of how I know they're related, and I know they're the same and slightly different, but I don't know exactly how.
So I think there's a few different things that might be at play here. One, we're on Twitter, and Twitter is very widely used now. So we're looking at a very small subset of total crypto users who we regularly interact with and hear from. And so our perception of the community defense forming around them might be greater than the reality. The other thing is Liberty Reserve wasn't tied so deeply to like a single community, right? Liberty Reserve was being used for gambling, for these pyramid schemes, for buying drugs, for paying for pornography, being used to launder these criminal funds. And so each of the communities who depended on Liberty Reserve were somewhat siloed, right? They were isolated in various forums, blogs, places like that. And so any effort to defend, preserve, whatever Liberty Reserve would likely similarly be fragmented. Since Tether is primarily, though not exclusively, primarily used in the cryptocurrency ecosystem, its defenders are all together in like the one place. And so I think that reduces the difficulty in coordination. And I think it is also cryptocurrency depends more on Tether than any single industry depended on Liberty Reserve. I think that is also true.
It's important to point out that not only the two founders were brought to justice, I don't know how else to put it in this case, but so was the chief technology officer, a Mr. Mark Marmolev, who, while not getting the lengthy sentences that the other two got, because they had previously done crimes, and they were under probation and fled to Costa Rica. But Mark Marmolev, the CTO, ended up going to prison for 5 years. Maybe got off earlier than that. I think that the American public, and perhaps this is more global than I think, but at least the American public is jaded and believes this concept that even if some entity or company does everything wrong and screws everybody, that the executives get off scot-free, that the people making bank on this, the equity holders, all of that, they just walk away from this unharmed in any way, shape, or form. And I can understand wanting to feel that way, but I also just don't think it's accurate. I think that we're going to start seeing it. I think we're seeing the beginning of regulatory moves in this space. So we're talking about Liberty Reserve because it was a forced shutdown of a company, like you said, that probably would have been able to go on indefinitely if not for them putting a halt to it. So when I think of Tether, when I think of USDC, when I think of these other US dollar derivatives, I don't think they're going to get shut down unless it is through regulatory action, whether I agree with it or not. I think that is generally the case. And we're beginning to see that now, don't you think?
I mean, we've seen the United States Federal Reserve issue warnings, the SEC issue warnings, the Treasury Department issue warnings. The New York Attorney General recently settled with the largest stablecoin. There's rumors that the executives of the largest stablecoin have gotten target letters from the Department of Justice. I think there's reasonably good evidence that we're in the midst of a regulatory awakening.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I think that might be the key point that we're making with this episode, at least why I think it's worth covering, is that the last US dollar derivative that didn't ask for every permission that it should got shut down big. And like you said, had the help of nations across the world, and also saw lengthy sentences for the founders. I mean, we're talking 20-year sentences for these dudes. The U.S. doesn't fuck around when it comes to the U.S. dollar. I think it's probably the one thing the U.S. cares about almost more than anything else. And so while I tend to agree with the phrase, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, I think if you're going to I was going to say counterfeit, but let's just go with make a dollar derivative of your own without asking permission, it's going to end up bad for everybody. But what do you think people should take away from what happened at Liberty Reserve?
One of the most important lessons that reading and learning about Liberty Reserve taught me is that the U.S. government takes a very broad view of their jurisdiction. Liberty Reserve was based in Costa Rica, first with one corporation, and then after that one got shut down, like 5 other shell corporations. But none of them were in the United States. But because they were using the US dollar, like you mentioned, the United States And because they were interacting with U.S. citizens and residents, the U.S.
And utilizing U.S. Let's not forget they're utilizing like correspondent U.S. banks, right? Like they're going through U.S. banking services to get dollars.
Yeah. And so if you touch the United States, if you interact with U.S. persons, if you're using United States correspondent banks, I think it's very likely the U.S. government will believe that your activities fall under their jurisdiction. This is going to be especially true if you are enabling unlawful actions and your thing looks a lot like the US dollar. Plus, the other thing I think it's important that people take away from this is that coordination and cooperation is possible between government agencies. It can often seem, and like I know this has often been one of my frustrations with following Tether, that there's a lot of silos and that it can be difficult for any one agency to really take care of major problems and stuff like that in the market. But there are times when they seem to come together and cooperate in order to bring especially the very large or very bad actors to heel.
And while I can only presume it will end in a fine and a slap on the wrist for Arthur Hayes, I think it's poignant to recall when he was doing that debate with Nouriel Roubini, who specifically said, you're going to get destroyed by U.S. regulators. What you guys are doing doesn't fall in line. And Arthur Hayes said something about in the Seychelles, like you just bribe people with coconuts or like whatever. The cocky attitude that a lot of these crypto dudes are giving nowadays, and we're seeing it from the Coinbase executive leadership, and we're seeing it from basically any entity that gets smashed by regulators right now, which seems to be a lot of them, including Binance and others. They don't respond with any level of respect, which is fine, right? I think they're taking a note from Elon Musk. The difference is that Elon Musk is a government-subsidized richest man in the world, and none of them are. And so while I might not like Elon Musk and what he does, and I might even have more in common with the goals of many of the people in cryptocurrency than I do with some asshole like Elon Musk, who do I think the government is really going to punish? Is it going to be the guy who's getting government subsidies to create electric cars in the desert? Or is it going to be the people blatantly helping money launderers and tax evaders? Who do I think they're actually going to target?
I mean, I could see the NHTSA or the NTSB giving Elon some more fines, but I think there's a lot more political will and a lot more opportunities for advancement if you bring a high-profile money laundering case, especially if the total dollar amounts you get to brag about end up in the billions.
Yeah, almost hundreds of billions, possibly. Anyway, I think that just about covers it. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think that it's a shadow bank that made a bunch of tokens that looked like $1.
Yeah, if that reminds you of anything, let us know. Join us next week. We're going to be discussing the Pandora Papers, which are being released by the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Thanks for listening.